Let's say tomorrow, ISIS ends up grabbing some poor American tourist off the streets of Cairo, Amman, Jordan, wherever, manages to get them before the TV cameras again and does another beheading. How many beheadings before we say, if there's an American life at risk, we've got to do something about it? You know, I keep getting questions about what are our interests in this. If you're worried about economic interests or security interests, you're not an American. There's a moral interest here. We can't stand by like we did in the Holocaust in Rwanda and Burundi this time. They almost wiped out the Yazidis, the Chaldeans, the Turkomans, the Assyrian Christians. We stand for something in this country. There's a moral, I think, interest in this. You know, we are the leaders of the free world, whether we like it or not. And I think the American people don't need too many more TV images or the potential for that. If we were to let this go by, and we were to have groups like I just mentioned, wiped out every man, woman, and child, if we were to continue to see Americans go through this, then I think it'll be to our shame in the long term. I'm going to go back to something somebody told me one time, and it was the decision that President Reagan had to make about Grenada. Remember, Beirut had just gone down. The appetite for another military commitment by the American people was just not there after what was considered a debacle in Beirut. And the political advice the president was receiving was, do not do this. You know, we don't have interest there. And I was told by a very wise advisor to the president that President Reagan, after getting this advice not to do it for political reasons, said, is there a possibility that American lives could be at risk? And someone said, Mr. President, there's some medical students there that could be at risk. Then he said, this is a clear decision. We go. That's the kind of president we want. That's the kind of decision we want. You know, we don't test the political winds. We decide based on whether American lives, interests, what we stand for is at risk. These terrorist groups metastasize very quickly. We saw Al-Qaeda turn into Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and all these other groups, and they're constantly morphing into something else. We now have ISIS, which is the new risen extremist group that probably is going to take over from Al-Qaeda because of its extremism, because of its location, because of its brutality, and it is capturing the imagination of radicalized youth around the world now. And because we allow it to seemingly be successful and grab the battle of the narrative away from us, it will recruit more. And there's coercive recruiting going on in the Sunni areas because we're letting them sit there. I think we lack, first of all, human intelligence. It's hard to penetrate these groups in any major way. Once we focus on them, we get a lot better, as we've seen recently. The numbers have begun to change now in our assessment. I think once we concentrate our assets, whether it's signals intelligence, it's satellite intelligence, it's working with the tribes and the groups in the region that have some insights into who they are and how they operate, you'll see our intelligence ratchet up more. The intelligence failure was we were caught by surprise with this. You know, they suddenly thrust into Iraq and in a very powerful way. I think we had two intelligence failures here. One is not understanding their power and their ability to do what they did, but I think we did not see the Iraqi military's inability to stand up to them. No amount of equipment or training could supplant the thing that you have to be willing to die for. And if the Maliki government could not give their people something to die for, their soldiers particularly, you're going to get the results you have. Yeah. And so I think the biggest failure we had was not in a better military assistance program, more tanks, more airplanes, more training. The failure is we did not put the pressure on the Maliki government to be more inclusive, to be able to understand that the different ethnic and religious groups had to be brought into a power-sharing role and a resource-sharing role. I was in Iraq right after Maliki got elected. Everywhere I went, to our embassy, to the military, the generals and our ambassadors that were there were many ambassadors, by the way, and to the ministries, the Iraqi ministries, every single one of them, when I asked them what's it going to take to make this a success, every single one of them says the Maliki government cannot control power in Baghdad and not distribute, delegate down to the provincial and district levels, particularly in the Sunni areas, and also distribute resources and have them have a say as to how they're meted out. And that's what happened. And I think it's false to believe there was some lack of, we should have stayed longer, there should have been more advisors. You cannot, we should have learned this from Vietnam. You can't have a Saigon where there's rotating generals that commit a coup a month and then ask the South Vietnamese to die for that. You can't ask the Iraqis to die for the Maliki government like you couldn't ask the Afghans to die for the Karzai government. We had better learn that when we go in and we break it, a la Colin Powell's Pottery Barn theory, you own it, and you also own what comes in place there if we're going to get into this nation-building process. I cannot imagine Douglas MacArthur accepting the Japanese to have something less than a full-blown democracy, with maybe allowing some traditional roles of the emperor in limited ways to be part of that, or an Eisenhower in Germany, allowing the government to kind of go its own way and become corrupt or dictatorial or some fashion. Why are we doing it now? Why have we done it ever since Vietnam? I mean, it's unclear to me that if we're going to expend our treasure, the lives and the casualties from our greatest treasure, our sons and daughters who put a uniform on, we ought to determine how this is going to go in terms of what kind of governance system is going to be in there that's responsive to the needs of the people and give them and their soldiers something to fight for. First of all, I would say it's important to understand there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. And the numbers that flock to this sort of radicalization may be in the tens of thousands totally, and the degree of commitment may be varied. There may be some young men there that are just off to think they're on an adventure. There are others that are in there because of despair. There are others that have been radicalized from their youth. When I was in Afghanistan, I went to Bagram prison, the prison we ran with all the really hardcore cases. And I went down into the cells and, looked at the people we had taken off the battlefield, some really hard cases, many of them illiterate, some of them some degree of education, but very, very few. I talked to the chaplain there, who was an Afghan Muslim cleric. And I asked them about how things were going and what we did. When we brought them off the battlefield, we obviously took care of them. We looked at their medical condition and helped in many ways physically to help them better off. He said, the most important thing you're doing here is you're teaching them to read. Actually, the Americans had a course in helping them read, and they were using the Quran. He said now for the first time they could read the Quran. And some of them were beginning to realize everything they had been told was opposite of what was written in the Quran. So you have to understand that this radicalization can come from a belief by those who impose a belief system on people that have no alternative to understand if it's right or wrong. And if they are under a condition of governance or economic situation that is really bad, this has appeal in some ways. There are programs in Yemen and Saudi Arabia of rehabilitation of people they pick up. And some of them, like the Yemeni program, has a very low recidivism rate, where they actually bring them in and work with them, and it's more of an education process, not a propagandization of them or a brainwashing of them, but to help them through to understand what radicalized them and how to take it apart.
And are imams part of that program?
Yes, they're actually run by imams. Now, I'm not saying that's a total solution. They have an appeal because there's disenfranchised youth, there's people that feel that their needs are not met, their aspirations are not met, there are people that are just crazy that are involved in this, and there are people that see this as a big adventure. Young people that go off and think there's some sort of a heroic, romantic piece to all this. some of whom begin to realize later on this is not the case and attempt to come back, especially from places like in Europe and other places. I would not coordinate with the Assad government. I would not coordinate with the Iranian government. First of all, understand they do not have our best interests at heart. They obviously, we at this moment have an enemy that both of us want to service in some way, kinetically, preferably. But don't think in the end that this is a kumbaya moment. And suddenly the Iranians and the Syrians and all of us are going to join and have in common some goal at the end. They will play this to their benefit, which will not be in line with our interests in the region. In terms of Syria, I would issue demarches. We are going to strike targets in Syria. We are going to strike ISIS targets. Do not interfere with our ability to do that, or the next visit of a sortie may be downtown Damascus. We sent a number of us NATO generals, went to Moscow. They came to us. We ran a series of conferences talking, and this was a conversation about how a military functions in a democracy. The time I spent in Russia, I actually had a Russian aide, a cadet from the propaganda corps. His name was Vlad. Perfected his English by listening to Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. But that effort was on track. The effort was, we are going to bring everybody into a collective feeling that we've just transitioned through something. It wasn't a war. We didn't win or lose. It might have been a Cold War in name, but we've evolved into something better. That effort just sort of faded away. The military connection, the political and diplomatic and economic connections. It was even difficult, I know, in working with Rich Armitage to get the Europeans to really get motivated to support this. And then the next thing that happened is we took the Warsaw Pact countries and rushed them into NATO. NATO without a mission or a purpose. Eastern European countries that came in that didn't live up to the requirement, the military standards. We went from 16 countries to 28. This was an in-your-face to the Russians. If there was nothing else that could have built this sense of nationalism and resentment, that was it. It gave birth to this throwback, Putin, to come into a place like that. Putin is trying to do two things right now. I don't think he wanted Ukraine, but it was dropped at his doorstep, and he's going to exploit it. He wants to, one, test American leadership in Europe and NATO. How strong is it? And he's going to push it to see how far it goes. Secondly, and most importantly, he's testing European resolve and commitment. Would they be willing to go the extra mile on sanctions, even if it hurt them economically?